are moving on to our panel focused on Europe, Africa and the Middle East regions, where we, of course, see a massive shift in the dynamics. For the first time in decades, Europe is playing catch-up with the need to build a modern supply chain whilst remaining an open market. EU trade policy is also trying to navigate a different policy scenario, shifting focus from FTAs to ethical sourcing and sustainability. Africa and the Middle East are trying, of course, to get into the game, moving away from being importers to being part of production. And Africa is trying to build a regional market, while the Middle East is trying to revolutionise its model from oil to leapfrog into electrification. Well, here are our panellists. Well, many thanks to Sigrid, Nathaniel and Markus for joining me this afternoon, and a very warm welcome to all of you. Sigrid, if I could start with you, how would you characterise the European automotive market today? And has the EU, do you think, fully recovered from the pandemic and the shortages that followed the pandemic?
Yeah, the EU vehicle production is indeed showing signs of a rebound to pre-pandemic levels. We're not where we were, and it may take a while, but and we also see growing threats to competitiveness and free trade. So there are also obstacles to overcome. But yeah, we're on the right track. And what we also see, and that's, I think, typical for today's market, is that the battery electric car market share is reaching record levels in the EU. So in terms of vehicle production in 2022, we were back at a level of about 13 million vehicles, which is 1 million more than in 2021. So the EU market share globally is now around 20% of car sales. So for cars, production grew at its fastest rate in the last 10 years, and that was reversing actually a consecutive decline of 4 years. And battery electric cars now make up of almost 15% of EU market share. That's, I think, a good sign. EU vehicle exports were also up. And I think it's noteworthy to say that around 18%, so 18% of EU exports go to the UK. The UK is still one of the top market destinations for EU vehicle exports, which is why it's so important that we do not apply unnecessary tariffs either side.
I think many people will be agreeing with you on that final point, Sigrid. Markus, maybe I can move to you now. What sort of bill of health would you give the African automotive market at the moment?
The market today consists of an old vehicle park of roughly 50 to 100 million vehicles. No one knows the exact number, with an average age of more than 10 years. And of course, the average age depends a lot on the individual country in Africa. Per year, circa about 4 to 6 million vehicles are added to this market, so the continent, and they have only approximately 500,000 to 1 million new ones, and 4 to 5 million old used vehicles, often from a Western world perspective, no longer really roadworthy, ABS, ESP catalysts taken out before shipping them from other regions to Africa. And so we, as the African Automotive Association, AAAM, want to change that situation. We want to replace much of these used vehicles with new vehicles, many or most of them then assembled or produced on the African continent. And that would mean that instead of today's 1 million vehicles that are assembled or produced in Africa, 4 to 6 million new vehicles would be produced and sold in 2035 on the continent. And in other words, more than 20 to 30 additional fully fledged OEM production plants would exist on the continent with the required supply ecosystem, which provides ample opportunity for everyone who wants to be part of this journey.
Gosh, that's quite a description, Markus. Fascinating, some of those figures there you're giving about the African market. What would you say, Markus, is the outlook in terms of if you could predict what the next few years would bring, what would you say?
Again, and I'm a vice president of AAAM, so we as the association, together also with our partners in Europe and SMMT, we are working with the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, Bank, the African Union, but also individual African countries on the definition and implementation of automotive strategies and policies that would attract automotive OEMs and suppliers. So very much what other regions of the world have been done already decades ago. So we are just at the start of this. And we have now got, as an automotive industry, an MOU as an industry and private sector with the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, Bank, and the African Union to that effect. And as I mentioned, the VDA, SMMT, and other associations from Europe and elsewhere also support us in these efforts. So I'm very, very optimistic that now that first countries in Africa, such as Egypt, have recently adopted such approaches and are in sync with the policies from other countries, such as South Africa. And we're again in contact with additional countries like Cote d'Ivoire or Algeria. And as the number grows and collaboration and free trade between these countries, we've just been talking about free trade and how important that is for us as an industry. If that is established, we'll progress definitely with the path to the 4 to 6 million vehicles produced in Africa in 10 to 15 years' time.
Well, Markus, thank you very much. All right, Nathaniel, let's turn our attention to your region, the Middle East. Of course, seen very much as an important export destination, specifically for the premium and luxury vehicles. Tell us what those businesses can expect from the negotiations that are ongoing between the UK and the Gulf Cooperation Council.
Absolutely, yes. So, as you say, the UK is negotiating a trade deal at the minute with the GCC. So that's made up of 6 countries: Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And good progress has been made since these negotiations were launched back in 2022. The 4th round of negotiations concluded in July, and we're expecting to host the 5th round of negotiations later on this year. In terms of numbers, the GCC is our 6th largest export market, and UK GCC trade is currently at record levels. Latest figures, I think, show all trade sort of totals £65.2 billion, so a huge market. And cars were the 3rd highest good exported from the UK to the GCC. However, only 1.8% of UK vehicle exports currently go to the GCC region. That's from 2022. So there's lots of room for growth, and I think the FTA will be a vehicle to facilitate that. It's an outrageous pun there, but yeah. And I think a trade agreement with the GCC will make trade easier and cheaper for UK exporters. Cars, I think, currently face tariffs of up to 5%. So in negotiations, we're seeking to remove or reduce those tariffs. As GCC countries diversify, I think, as you've alluded to previously, their economies are going to be moving away from a reliance on fossil fuels. And so an agreement with the GCC would create opportunities for our EV industry here in the UK. Through the FTA as well, we're also seeking to reduce regulatory obstacles, efficient and transparent customs procedures when trading with the GCC, and that will also benefit the automotive manufacturers and exporters sector. And then I think also I heard you mention sort of rules of origin previously, and again, I think that the FTA again is another vehicle to sort of help us look into simplifying and modernising those rules of origin. So lots and lots of different things that the FTA will be able to solve for us.
All right, thank you. Sigrid, can I bring you back in? Let's turn our attention back to the EU. And certainly the EU's sort of mood music coming out of the EU on international trade policy has shifted a bit recently. We've certainly seen the EU looking as if it's flexing its muscles, rather, if I can put it that way. In your view, what do you think the EU's top trade policy priorities are, and how do they square with the interests of this industry, of automotive?
Yeah, crucial question, very interesting question. And let's try and unpack it a little bit. So the EU has placed, I believe, a reasonable emphasis on strengthening its strategic autonomy. But it's also time to bring back a focus on open, back to the forefront. So they have been using for a number of years now the concept of open strategic autonomy, and within this the critical focus has been on autonomy, and in other words security, and open has been somewhat neglected. So initiatives have been aimed at providing the EU with a set of tools to defend its interests in a challenging geopolitical context. They have, for example, appointed a chief trade enforcement officer about 3 years ago. And since then, we do see a more pronounced willingness to take trade cases against third countries. And the most recent initiation of the anti-subsidy case against China is, I think, the most obvious example. We've also seen a very interesting dynamic between the EU and the US, whereby their very differing approaches to defending the security of their domestic industry has created quite a bit of friction over recent years. And relations have been much more positive under the Biden administration, but there's still many complex issues that need to be solved. And yeah, where really they're tedious, these discussions on global trade issues. So while the EU automobile industry understands the importance for the EU to strengthen its strategic autonomy, in certain areas the open dimension needs more attention, because our industry per default is a global one. We operate in the EU, the UK, but also the US and China for that matter, and elsewhere. So this free, fair, open trade is very, very important. So we support an ambitious, open and positive trade agenda that brings to the front international partnerships once again, and the conclusion of ongoing trade negotiations with Australia, as well as the ratification of FTAs with Mercosur and Mexico is really very, very important. I think also an ambitious FTA agenda is important in the current geopolitical context, as it will really help diversify import sources, as well as the opening of new export markets for European companies. And we believe that reliance on a global value chain is not only inevitable because we can't be self-sufficient in Europe, but it's really desirable as it helps build alliances across the globe, which in turn then also mitigate geopolitical risks. So initiatives that have been taken in the EU, like creating a critical raw materials club, and also conclusion of bilateral partnerships with resource-rich countries are really very, very welcome.
Very interesting. Loud and clear, Sigrid. Very interesting. You mentioned in your first answer to me how important the UK relationship is, and you mentioned that 18% statistic. But of course, we've got the threat of tariffs on EVs looming large. I just wonder what your demands or your requests are on that issue to help that relationship, the relationship between where you are and where I am.
Yeah, we're very clear really on this. ACEA calls for a 3-year extension to the rules of origin under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and failure to act could mean 4.3 billion euros in costs, and it could cut EU production of electric vehicles, which is the sector that we really need and want to build up, by about 480,000 units, which is the average of about 2 plants. That will be lost, and try get it back. That is pretty difficult. So the UK is one of the most important markets for exports of EU battery electric vehicles. It's the first by volume and the second by value. And as of the 1st of January 2024, the battery rules of origin under the EU-UK TCA will become more restrictive as it looks today. And given the current early stage of development of the battery supply chain in Europe, in the EU and also in the UK, the vast majority of batteries will be unable to meet this rule. So it's not that it's not going to be there. We don't criticize the fundamental principle of this. It's just that the building up of this value chain takes more time, probably more time than many expected. We also had these unforeseen circumstances like the pandemic, like a war in the Ukraine with economic fallout, inflation, what have you. So it's difficult enough to build up this value chain in such a limited space of time, and there have been obstacles, and it would really be not very useful or sensible to now put tariffs in place and make these industries' life even more difficult. So again, this is not countering the attempts to build up this value chain. We need that. It's happening. Massive investments underway also from the side of OEMs, so vehicle manufacturers. We're all part of this ecosystem. It's not just, and it should not just be about having a thriving battery value chain in Europe. It should be about having a thriving auto industry in Europe and in the UK. And that's why we make this point very, very clear. We would like to see the battery rules of origin temporarily liberalized, so for the 2024-2026 period. And that's our clear call to policymakers on both sides of the channel.
Sigrid, thank you. That was crystal clear. I'm sure lots of people will be relieved to hear it, at least to hear how adamant you are. Nathaniel, let's go back to your region, the Gulf. Obviously, lots of past association, of course, with oil production, but actually a lot going on in your region on EVs and on electrification. How will all of what's happening in your region impact ongoing trade discussions, do you think?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think, so from a UK perspective, we do see ourselves as a global leader on climate action, and the government is committed to maintaining our standards of environmental protection within any free trade agreement that we agree. An agreement with the GCC is the same in that respect, and it could represent a large opportunity for our renewable energy sector and green technologies industry, and this includes electric vehicles. I think the GCC member states also recognise a need to transition towards renewable energy and reduce their reliance on fossil fuel production. And that's set out in their vision plans, which I'll speak a little bit about later. We've seen sort of ambitious net zero commitments made quite recently by GCC member states, so the UAE and Saudi Arabia, for example, and I think that demonstrates their intentions within that area. And the expertise and experience of UK companies could offer significant mutual benefits, which will bolster all partners' commitments to green energy and taking forward these critical new technologies. So I mentioned the vision plans, and what they sort of are is initiatives brought in by the countries within the Gulf to diversify their economies, and electrification will play a big part of that. So our embassy in Saudi Arabia has been monitoring the Saudis' Vision 2030, which is aiming to reduce its reliance on oil revenue. And this means that the Saudis are continuing to drive growth in new industries like EV. So, for example, they recently announced their first electric vehicle brand, which is called ACEA. And the company aims to lead the Saudi Arabians' automotive manufacturing sector. And although distribution plans will be focused on Middle Eastern markets, they are also expecting to attract over $150 million in foreign direct investment. So a huge opportunity for UK businesses there. And then additionally, the Saudi Public Investment Fund, the PIF, is the largest shareholder in the EV maker Lucid Group, and they've recently opened its first international EV factory in Saudi Arabia. So I think that example just sort of perfectly illustrates the region's appetite for electrification, for EVs, and will be continued to be plugged into developments like this across our network of embassies in the region. And we will also be proactively seeking out opportunities for UK companies as this sector within the region continues to grow.
Oh, very interesting. Well, Sigrid, as is obvious from what we've just been hearing, you know, there are lots of other markets and other regions that are sort of nipping at the heels of the Europeans. It's very interesting that almost in some ways the European market is having to play catch up or fight very hard to regain its lead on those cutting edge technologies. So how far do you think the region is from building a robust e-mobility supply chain?
Oh, we're well on track, but a lot needs to happen in very little time. So the race is on, and our motto really is let's stay in the race. And to remain competitive globally, we really need to secure a level playing field for sustainably made European vehicles by defending fair and free trade rules and also ensuring access to critical supplies. So today, the raw materials required for e-mobility are almost exclusively of non-European origin. China controls about 75% of the global EV battery supply chain, including having a near monopoly on rare earths. So we hope that the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act will enhance domestic capacity for mining, but also processing and you know, really address some of these imbalances that we see. But yeah, we're not for nothing calling it a race. The race is on. We need to stay in that race. We're confident that we can. We've also recently in Munich at the vehicle show seen a great portfolio of cars being presented by all European manufacturers. So there's a lot of competition. But yeah, of course, competition is also in the DNA of this industry. They're used to it, they're thriving at it, and they need the circumstances, the framework to do well as much as they need their own, you know, competitiveness and ingenuity and engineering and innovation might. So yeah, but we're calling really on the EU, also having the elections firmly in view next year, June, also the new policymakers coming in to really continue on this road, reduce you know, time that it takes to get permitting procedures done, burdensome reporting and assessment procedures, all of these kind of things that are more typical, you could say, for the EU, for Europe, than elsewhere in the world, and they hamper competitiveness, they hamper, you know, taking up speed. And as I said before, we need to really also secure access to critical raw materials through trade deals, and that includes specific raw material agreements with third countries. And of course, it's not only about raw materials, that's sometimes forgotten, but securing access to affordable green energy from reliable partners is also very, very important, because many of the new manufacturing processes, like you know, building up this battery chain or getting battery packs together, but also semiconductors, for example, they require a lot of energy, and yeah, to decarbonize the economy, we need that energy to be cheap, affordable, available, and reliably there.
Sigrid, thank you. Markus, as Sigrid was just saying, this is a very crowded field and a very competitive race, a global race in this market. How is Africa placed in that race, would you say?
I mean, I think there's two elements. I've just earlier on expanded a little bit about what we're doing on the supply side and regulation, etc. But just building on what has just been said, for example, regarding the battery electric paradigm, but also the hydrogen economy, Africa has a huge role to play, because a lot of the raw material that China is, for example, processing originally comes from Africa. So, and Africa is the neighboring continent of Europe. So in terms of beneficiation, local beneficiation, becoming much more a player in the local or in the global automotive industry, from a raw material supplier, and not only raw material supplier, critical minerals supplier. I've just been here on a panel in Cape Town, where I'm currently in, which is actually the Critical Minerals Summit. And we were also talking about what type of role Africa could play in the automotive industry, global automotive industry. So, and in this value chain. So that is definitely one aspect. The second aspect that I just briefly wanted to mention, why I'm also very optimistic on the future role of the African continent. I was just talking about these 4 to 6 million vehicles. And they're already there today. And that market is there, but used cars, actually junk cars. It's not really proper cars. So it's really a new market of another 4 to 6 million vehicles, and the middle class in Africa is growing. Middle class is maybe 20% of the population, 15%. No one really knows the exact statistics, but it's 1.3 billion people. So that these 4 to 6 million cars in 2035 as new cars, if they're affordable cars and decent cars, etc., can be sold on the African continent. It's to a certain degree is a no-brainer if we do really all the right things. And these 4 to 6 million cars, essentially already 2 to 3 million cars could just come from 4 countries, namely South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, and Algeria. So we only need to get it right in these 4 countries, and the rest of the continent could move on. And that's why I am so optimistic, because also Africa is the last frontier for the automotive industry. It is the only country where so far very few new vehicles are sold.
Very, very interesting. And sticking with Africa, Markus, let's think about the chances of a Pan-African trade agreement. What impact would an agreement like that have?
I mean, the agreement already exists, and it's been ratified by all but one of the more than 50 member states. And so in that sense, it is no longer a question whether the agreement will be there. The African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is ratified, as I just mentioned. So it is just a matter to implement it. And here I'm also very proud to say that as the Automotive Association in Africa, we've actually succeeded in defining a strategy, but not only a strategy, but also an implementation plan that was adopted in February this year by the presidents of the African Union member states. And so in that sense, if we now get all of this right, the sky is the limit for the African automotive industry. And as I said, it's no longer a matter of whether this free trade area exists. I mean, it exists, but it needs to obviously be put to life, and we need to implement everything so that it can work.
Understood. And Markus, just one last question on this subject for you. Beyond car assembly, talk to me about what expertise, what specialisation there are in your region that exist, and will trade integration support parts manufacturing, do you think?
So, I mean, now I can possibly rather talk with my hat as president of Bosch for Africa, and we are one of the largest automotive suppliers, obviously. So we are very interested in parts manufacturing, also for the African continent. But just as for the OEM, scale is of paramount importance to establish component manufacturing. But today already we have got local production of aftermarket products such as batteries and filters in Tunisia, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, etc. And North Africa today is already a key hub for wiring harness manufacturers for African and European OEM plants. So it's not that we need to start from scratch. There is already something there that we can build on.
Markus,
we just need the scale.
Thank you. Just need the scale. Understood. Nathaniel, let's go back to the Middle East. And that area is sometimes an area that people think, because it's not a homogenous region where the rules are the same in every different economy or every different country. So people think that it's possibly quite a complicated place to do business with lots of different different areas with different rules. What do you think the main barriers are that the automotive businesses face across the region?
That's absolutely right. So I think the economies of the GCC vary widely. And then there's also those countries that are outside of the GCC, which we work with on a bilateral basis. And it's completely different negotiating with, trying to trade with Saudi Arabia versus, say, Jordan, who's not in the GCC. And of course, that means that doing business across the region varies very widely. And that's why it's important for us here at the Department for Business and Trade to be engaging with the automotive sector so we can identify the barriers that are faced by businesses operating in the region. And it's also why we're incredibly grateful to work with partners like SMMT to identify issues which we can then analyse across our overseas network to find ways to resolve them. So I currently mentioned, I think I mentioned at the start that cars currently face a tariff of up to 5%. We're seeking to remove or reduce tariffs through our FTA negotiations, the same way we're seeking to reduce regulatory obstacles and lobby for transparent customs procedures. But there are also some prevalent issues that we will look to resolve outside of FTA negotiations. So one example I can give you on that is for example, the Saudi Standards Authority, they currently require compliance with an outdated regulation, the UN ACEA Regulation 83, which utilises the new European driving cycle emissions test for electric vehicles. This was originally introduced in the 80s, and it has been it's been replaced by the worldwide harmonised light vehicle test procedure that was designed to take its place. But Saudi Arabia is one of the last markets and pretty much the last territory that requires compliance with this outdated NEDC test. Our overseas network, our embassy in Saudi Arabia, is continuing to lobby the Saudi Standards Authority via our embassy on this. And there are also various other issues that we've been discussing with SMMT that are still pending research and under construction. But we're still keen to consider the work, really closely. We're continuing to work really closely with them because we want to increase the UK's automotive industry access across the market, and that includes those sort of quite niche areas where we can lobby governments on a bilateral basis.
Right, so there's plenty in your intro, I think, Nathaniel. I think that's fair to say. I don't know if you've exhausted all the solutions in your previous answer. I'm just wondering if there are any other, or the types of solutions that the UK government is potentially exploring with the different GCC countries.
Absolutely, yes. So as I mentioned, the UK GCC FTA will be a vital tool to sort of tackle some of the most prevalent market access barriers. There are a range of things that we can do outside of FTAs for specific industries like the automotive sector. So firstly, we've got the capacity to sign memorandums of understanding with partner countries to help strengthen cooperation and resolve market access issues. So for example, in 2020, the Engineering Council signed a cooperation agreement with the Kuwait Society of Engineers, and that's helped to facilitate the mobility of engineering professionals between the UK and Kuwait. And our colleagues at DBT work really closely with our overseas network to facilitate those kind of bilateral agreements, and they can be beneficial for sectors like the automotive sector. And there are also a number of bilateral trade and investment committees between the UK and partner countries where trade liberalisation across different sectors can be discussed and agreed. So, for example, government ministers from the UK and Qatar meet annually for the Joint Economic and Trade Committee, and that the aim of that is to enhance our trading relationship. So, for example, in 2022, the meeting of ministers concluded with the signing of a joint statement, in which both governments committed to tackling market access issues on both sides in a range of priority sectors, which includes the automotive sector. And I think partnerships like this are incredibly critical for us because when the automotive sector approach us with a market access issue, we have these prior commitments and these prior committees in place with partner governments that we can utilise to help solve those problems when they arise. And I think finally, just another tool at our disposal is just good old-fashioned diplomacy. The department has, we represent 11 markets across the Middle East, and I think we've got a team of over 120 staff in country lobbying partner governments and trying to also understand what the business environment is like on the ground. And as our overseas network is plugged into everything that we're doing in London, we're able to offer export support for UK businesses, and just through that sort of global ecosystem that we've got across the region, we're able to unlock extensive trading opportunities.
All right, Nathaniel, thank you very much. Markus, let's have another look at Africa. You gave us a very interesting pen portrait of African, the car registrations, and it's clear from that description that you were giving us earlier that EV registrations aren't going to be picking up in the very near future. But of course, the other issue in Africa is critical materials for EV and battery manufacturing. Describe the opportunities and challenges on that.
I mean, next to what I've just already said a little bit earlier, the two main aspects to consider when pondering that, there are two main aspects to consider when pondering that question that you've just asked. One is responsible mining, and the other is local beneficiation with all the ensuing benefits for the local population. And in both aspects, in my experience now being 10 years here on the ground in Africa, we still have quite a way to go. And last but not least, in making sure that the right skill set becomes widespread amongst the local population. So everything is there in principle, everything is here, the raw materials are here on the ground. But to get to that local beneficiation and get to responsible mining and get the right skills here on the ground, it needs a lot of, Africa also in my viewpoint, needs a lot of help, but on eye-to-eye level. And so if European countries, including the UK, could start that discussion on this, I know that they have already started that discussion, but if we can really make progress with these discussions, again, there's many more opportunities than these challenges that I just mentioned.
Markus, thank you. And sticking with you, Markus, talk to us about the opportunities for specifically UK or European firms to do business in the region. What's it like doing business from Europe into Africa?
I mean, again, there's a lot of joint links, whether it is UK or whether it's other European companies or Europe as a whole. And it's just our neighboring continent, Africa. I mean, if you are in Gibraltar, you're just hopping around the pond, and it's a few kilometers, and you are in Morocco. And what I've just said in terms of the market opportunity that we see that is now coming as from 2035, the opportunities are huge. So as we get rid of the old vehicle park by increasingly replacing it with new vehicles produced on the continent, or if we also have free trade agreements between UK, the EU and the continent, both the automotive aftermarket as well as the OE business for UK and European firms will increase exponentially. That's why I would only encourage UK and European companies to join us in Africa on our journey as the African Association of Automotive Manufacturers to tackle this last frontier of the global automotive industry. And here again, I would give very many thanks to SMMT. We've started to engage with them a year ago, but there's also other European associations, and we are getting quite a bit of support. So now we also need to get more members to also get really excited about the African continent as much as I am.
Well, certainly your excitement is very clear and rather contagious. But of course, there is a flip side. If you're excited about that industry or that area of the world, you might be concerned about a different area of the world. So, Sigrid, let me turn to you and say, as a major exporter, of course, the European sector has often advocated for more trade openness. But do you think, or do you expect the sector to perhaps take a bit more of a defensive approach going forward if imports from the new kids on the block, from the new players, gain ground in your neck of the woods, in the European region?
No, frankly, I don't. Free and fair trade has been really vital to the success of the European automotive sector and the foundation of its global success. And I really don't see any sign of a change of heart in this respect, rather to the contrary. So, yeah, we understand there's fierce competition. Some would call it a threat at our doorsteps. We also understand and support the EU legislative being more assertive, and there is in today's age no space for being naive. Everybody has to stand up for themselves and make the case. But what we believe is that most of all, Europe itself needs a robust and comprehensive industrial strategy that will enable us as an industry to rival other world regions on an equal footing. Healthy competition really drives innovation, and it helps provide ever greater choices for consumers. So yeah, for free and fair trade, we need a level playing field between all competitors. That also means that you should be able to hold each other accountable, and therefore we have rules-based systems and what have you. But it also means that we need to acknowledge interdependencies. I mentioned the global value chains and the availability of raw materials before. So we in Europe need to have our own house in order, mostly before looking at other things. And what we now need to do really is to master this massive transformation to green technology and to decarbonizing our economies and industry and mobility and transport. And this means ensuring access to critical materials and affordable energy, a more supportive regulatory framework, because the EU still tends to regulate, whereas China, incentivizes and also the US are more on that track. And we need a charging and refilling infrastructure, for people and businesses to use these new vehicles that are increasingly available. We need the purchase and procurement incentives to get market take-up even more robust, and so on and so on. So we believe that's where we should focus, and exporting and importing is part of our world, part of our DNA, and no change of heart there whatsoever.
Loud and clear. We've got just a few minutes for some questions. I want to thank those of you who've already sent some questions. If you've got a burning desire to ask a question of our panellists, you can use the buttons that should be at the bottom of your screen. You've just got a couple of minutes to send me your thoughts and questions. But Sigrid, let's start with one for you. What lessons can we learn to ensure future trade agreements can be fully utilised and accessed by traders? So lessons we can learn, Sigrid.
Well, make them as simple as possible and don't take so long to negotiate them or agree them, which of course is easier said than done. And apply the same rules across the board as much as possible. So harmonize, take again these rules of origin in the UK, EU, TCA. The thresholds there are different than those agreed in other FTAs, and we think that's not very helpful. There should be more harmonization, and I think that will help everybody in the end. So yeah, be pragmatic, be quick, be spot on, and find also the tools that are most appropriate. Sometimes this is a fully fledged FTA, and sometimes it's more like a bilateral agreement or partnership agreement or cooperation. So yeah, I think the toolbox is larger than maybe we thought until fairly recently.
Okay, that seems fair enough. Be quick, be transparent, and be fair. Nathaniel, there's a question for you. How can technology support supply chains in meeting free trade requirements? How can we harness technology in that way?
So I think this is mainly about the government being plugged into the sector and just being aware of developments that are happening across different sectors and industries, because as the negotiations for free trade agreements develop, as does technology. And I think it's very important that for me, within the bilateral trade relations department, team in the department, being plugged into the sector through sort of regular engagement is going to be really important to ensure that everything that we are negotiating is comprehensive and modern and reflects the technology of the day. I think we're making, in terms of the GCC, I think we're making great progress, and the negotiations only began last year. But even in that time, we've seen things within the UK move in terms of technology, and I think just being plugged into businesses is really important for that.
Lovely, thank you very much. Really interesting question for you, Markus, that's just come in. The questioner says, in the same way that in many African countries, internet and phone connections leapfrogged straight into mobile and wireless without being hampered by legacy landline infrastructure, as we were in Europe and elsewhere. So the question follows on, could African countries equally leap forward with non-fossil fuelled vehicles? Could you be ahead of the curve because of the lack of legacy?
We are actually asking ourselves that question a lot, because we still have not even Euro 1 vehicles very often running around the streets. And Africa can be the main hydrogen production hub for the world. So hydrogen internal combustion engines could actually be an excellent solution, which is then also almost carbon neutral or carbon neutral. And that could provide huge amounts of opportunities for Africa, which would actually then be leapfrogging. So battery electric vehicles probably less, because there is just no electricity in Africa. But hydrogen, either fuel cell, but even more so hydrogen internal combustion engines. And that provides huge amount of opportunity also for jobs.
Very interesting. Just a couple of minutes left. So I've got another one for you, Sigrid. This questioner says that you mentioned the FTA between the EU and Mercosur. How is the negotiation going? And do you expect some advancements in the near future? Basically, what can you tell us?
Well, they are going, and it's a bit back and forth. I don't know how quickly this will now end, but I think many people really are ambitious about this and want it to come to a conclusion soon. So that's what I can tell you.
Well, thank you for the update there. One final question, and I'm afraid it's for you, Sigrid, again. I'm sorry, I feel like we've put so much in your direction. This question says, how concerned are European manufacturers that steps by the EU to support retaining production in Europe could inadvertently end up supporting non-EU produced vehicle uptake? Could you almost shoot yourselves in the foot?
Yeah, I think it's a fine line to walk and real balance to be found. Equally, you know, if tariffs were to be applied, at some point you could have a quicker coming over to the EU of foreign manufacturers to produce here. But I think in the end, it's really about fair and open competition for the best product, and you know, bringing these to consumers and to market, and that's where we should be focusing on. Yeah, there's a lot of chances to shoot ourselves in the foot. But that shouldn't be our focus, really. We need to get this right and work together to get there.
Well, I'm afraid that is all we've got time for, but thank you so much to everybody who asked questions. And of course, thank you to the panel, to Sigrid, to Nathaniel and to Markus for joining me this afternoon.